All right, so in order to do this and kind of talk about how we put these pixels together, I'm just going to give you a little bit of math background. And I know people are like, oh God, please no math. It's good math. That in order for us to analyze all this data and to basically to combine all this data, we kind of have to do crowd theory. Has anybody heard of crowd theory before? Don't worry, I will tell you all about it. This guy is Sir Francis Galton. Anybody heard of him before that hasn't heard me talk before? No, nobody. One person. Well, hopefully by the end of this talk you will. He was a scientist way back in the day. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin. Good genetics there. Okay. He was also a tropical explorer, a geographer, meteorologist. He was a jack of all trades. Usually what would happen is he would find somebody to have a kernel of an idea, and he would basically take that and expand on it. He was one of the people that really pushed the use of fingerprinting for police work. Well, he was also known as the father of eugenics, and this is probably the reason why you haven't heard of him. The idea that there's, some genetic sequence will some the outliers would actually, be the best. What I'm going to tell you about when I'm going to talk about with the wisdom of crowd stuff that he did, it kind of actually disproves that. And that's what we're kind of seeing in scientific research. It's not the one study, the one great study that changes the field. It's all the studies built together. How do we take all of this information and find basically the answer to that? He was a geneticist. He was influenced by Charles Darwin. He pioneered the bioinformatic approach, which is basically, how do I measure all the, is basically the field is, how can I measure all these things about something and use that information to gain knowledge about it? So I think he would be very comfortable in today's, genetic world. And he influenced me most as a statistician. He was one of the founders, or at least the originators of the concept of variance and standard deviation. He also developed the concept of correlation. And we're going to use this, and BaseSpace uses this concept quite a bit, is that how do I take my data set, all the stuff that I do, and compare it to everything else that's out there? That's correlation. And we're going to get into how are we actually comparing your data to everything else that's out there. And then what I'm going to spend the most time on is, or just basically going to talk about, is the wisdom of crowds. And we'll explain what that means as far as research goes. And just some of his students. Karl Pearson, everybody's familiar with his name, right? Pearson correlation test, maybe heard of it. He was his Sir Francis Galton was his mentor. He loved his mentor so much he wrote a 3-volume biography on the man. I have not read that, nor do I want to. It's a long one. They influenced Charles Spearman. It's basically the Pearson correlation test. It's the non-parametric version of that. And one of Karl Pearson's students was a guy named by William Gossett. Does anybody know what famous statistical test William Gossett developed? Just offhand. It's the most famous one, probably. T-test. He was working for Guinness at the time. I'm sorry, I always go off on a tangent, but it's a good story anyway. So you can tell this at Thanksgiving dinner. So he was working at the Guinness brewery, and actually he was kind of slumming. He needed some more money. Guinness wanted to figure out if they could determine whether if they shipped their beer farther than, say, 60 miles, whether it would affect anything in the beer. Up until that point, they wouldn't ship their beer farther than that. And everybody in Ireland was getting pretty ornery. And I'm Irish, so I know exactly what they're talking about there. So he basically came up with a statistical test to determine whether, did any of these variables change. He found that there was really no, big difference, if they shipped it farther, and Ireland's been rejoicing ever since. So the funny thing is, though, he didn't name it after himself. He was so ashamed that he was working at the brewery. Does anybody know what a t-test is called? Student's t-test. He named it Student's t-test. He put it in anonymously. The world's greatest statistical test, and it's not even named after him. If he was Fisher, he would have named the heck out of it. Finally, a math joke hits. All right. How about Nate Silver? Does everybody know what Nate Silver is? Who Nate Silver is? Yeah. Especially with the election. Trust me, I'm not going to talk very much about the election. I promise. But this guy in 2012, this is where he first busted on the scene, I think, in a big way, is that he predicted every major election in 2012. Do you think he actually polled any people? Did you think he even asked anybody who they were voting for? No. What he did, and this is kind of what this software does, and this is this whole wisdom of crowd thing, is he found all the polls that were out there on the election. Some obviously biased left, some biased right. It's kind of like, science experiments too, lab groups. Basically, all he did was take the average of all those different polls and basically predicted every election or every major election in 2012. We can do the same thing with this biological software. What I'm going to do is, take you through this and how do we use this wisdom of crowd with this, using correlation engine. Okay, well, let me talk about it because I think, the wisdom of crowd's kind of theory underlies a lot of this stuff, and it definitely should be underlying bioinformatics. Francis Galton, he was in his early 90s. This was about, I think it was early 1900s. He went to a English fair, and at the English fair, they were having a contest. And what they were doing is they were auctioning off the weight of a bull, or not the weight of the bull. They were auctioning off the meat of the bull to the person who guessed closest to the weight of that processed meat. So lots of people, to get all that, meat was a huge thing, I'm sure, in early 19th century England. So everybody was trying to guess. Everybody was trying to make their best guess. There was about 800 guesses. Let me kind of show this to you. There was 800 guesses for, issued for it, so people had to buy in. I have no idea what a sixpenny is, but I'm sure it wasn't cheap. Or 13 tickets were rejected for being defective or ineligible. Asked the names, addresses, estimates of the bull. So at the end, what he was able to do is get 787 different guesses from people that were at that fair. Some of these, and what he thought was, this is the eugenics guy, he thought his experts would be a much better guess than all the non-experts that were also in the crowd. So what did he find? Well, he found that no one got the exact weight of the processed meat, right? In fact, some people were way off. But what he realized is that there was lots of people way off that were under and lots of people that were over. And that was about equal. And so what he did was when he actually took the median or the average of all their guesses, it was in 1 pound of the actual weight of the bull, right? Picture it like this. And this is, I think this is the easiest way I can kind of get crowd theory, what we're trying to do with bioinformatics is that if you had a bullseye, if you had people throwing at a dartboard, say you get 800 people to throw at a dartboard, no one hits the bullseye, right? But I bet if I took the geometric mean of all the people that threw at that dartboard, the middle is probably going to be right where the bullseye is. That's what we're doing with kind of bioinformatics, or at least all this biological information. I don't trust that one group got it exactly right. And in fact, some groups might be terrible and some might be really good. But if I can get the average of all of those different, if I'm looking at, say, somebody's looking at lung cancer and I have all these different studies that look at the same thing, the answer is probably right in the middle. And that was his conclusion that, hey, this is, I was surprised it worked, but it did. And he also made a note that, hey, maybe we should study this a little more, right? That this is, given the result here, this is probably something that we could use for other things. And sure enough, people have, right? Once he came up with it, we have basically been reproducing wisdom of crowds for the last 100 years now, right? There's a book that just came out. I don't know if anybody read this, Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki. Anybody familiar with that book? No? It was popular for a while. And again, I mentioned, Nate Silver, he has his website, 538, kind of built on the same thing. They're making predictions on the elections, and they are not actually doing the studies themselves, right? They're not running the polls. They're sitting over all those polls, making the predictions based on the data, kind of like a bioinformatician. Even the CIA, the government's getting into this. Does anybody hear about the government is actually, the CIA is actually using common citizens to basically do some of their, basically what they're doing is they're getting common citizens and they're asking them questions like, do you think Russia's going to invade Ukraine before November, right? And they don't give them anything else. They don't train it. They just they go, here's some websites, go find the data on your own. And what they're finding is all these common citizens, when allowed to do this, are making, when you take the average of all their guesses, it's better than their analysts that have been doing this their whole lives. Again, this is the kind of thing that we can do in biology now, or bioinformatics. Just briefly, some of the requirements of that is that diversity. You can't, and that was kind of what went, I'm going to talk about the election again. That's kind of what went wrong with this last election, is we didn't have the diversity. We didn't poll everybody. We had big holes. And so you had all these groups trying to fill that hole with all this math. And it didn't work out so well. And independence too. And that was another problem with the election, is that after a while, when enough people start analyzing, people in the same lab will start doing things exactly the same way. And that's why I think this, mining all this public data works so well, is everybody does their own different thing. Even if they're looking at the same condition, everybody will have their own different techniques. And that's what we want. We want independence. And they'll also have their own different focus as well. And then, specialization, people are knowledgeable in specific fields and aggregation. And that's the key thing here. How do we take all that information and basically bullet it down into one, right? And I'm going to show you how to do that with my demos. So, yeah. Why does this matter in biology? Because there's lots and lots of crowds in bioscience. And so now what I'm going to do, so it is this, what I'm going to show you is the correlation engine. And this is where we kind of gain those crowds. And if you look here, they have already done the hard work for you, which makes things nice. I don't have to program anything. I don't have to go to Geo and pull up all these data sets that are a pain in the butt. They have been curated here already. What I can now do through point and click is I can basically do my analysis on their site using millions, and in fact, billions of dollars worth of research. Well, you have to buy the software. I was going to say for free, but not really.